Because I had one apartment complex I got back. They wanted like
All right, we are ready to start the lecture part of tonight. It is 6:30, and we're ready to go. So if we'll stand, we'll pray, and we'll begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth, Lord of our present, fills to all things, the treasury of good things, and give of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. All right, we are... Last week, we began this series. It was entitled From the Apostolic Fathers to the Great Martyrs. We went from, we first had to, in a sense, set the stage by reviewing, if you can quickly review, history from creation to the time of Christ, and then from the time of Christ to the Great Martyrs, the majority of them, the saints we call Great Martyrs, the majority of them suffered under the persecution of Diocletian around the year 300. And that's kind of where we left it off. So tonight we pick up at that point, and we're going to backtrack just a little bit to understand the context of the Roman Empire that led up to the emergence of Diocletian, what's called the Tetrarchy, the division of the empire's governance by, in a sense, 4 emperors instead of just one, and then how St. Constantine emerges in the midst of that context. So, one note from last week, I discussed how the church at times will refer to itself as the Christian nation, or as a nation or the Christian race. And as I was doing some reading this morning in the Gospel of Matthew, this is exactly the language Christ uses in one of his parables when he's talking to the Pharisees, and he says to them, and in a sense, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a different nation. A different nation showing the fruits of repentance. So the idea that the church, in a sense, is a nation, that context is spoken of as by Christ himself. So it's a nation without ethnicity, of course, and it's a nation without geographical boundaries, but it is a nation in that sense. So St. Constantine and the Roman Empire's embrace of Christ. That's the title for tonight's lecture. So by the 2nd century, you have a troubled Roman Empire. There is a decline in population by the end of the 2nd century due to a number of factors: incessant warfare, famine, plague, and low birth rate. There were far fewer women than men in the Roman Empire. And this is partly due to the practice of infanticide, along with Roman views of women's inferiority to men. All of these contributed to the, in a sense, lopsided demographics in the Roman Empire. So because there were fewer women, there were fewer births. We had a declining, in a sense, birth rate. I'll be quoting at times a text called The History of Byzantium by Timothy E. Gregory. This next quote comes from him describing, in a sense, the context of the 2nd into the 3rd century, the 100s into the 200s. So, the 50 years between the death of Severus Alexander, which is one of the Roman emperors, and the ascension of Diocletian, this is a period of 235 to 284, that's the time period we're talking about here, witnessed the near collapse of the whole Roman way of life. From the government and military structure to the economy and the whole system that had characterized the ancient world until then. In political terms, no emperor during this entire period of about 50 years was secure, and nearly every one of them died a violent death at the hands of rebels. The frontiers of the empire gave way, the enemies of the state, especially in the north and the east, came flooding in, and various parts of the empire became essentially independent. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed, inflation drove prices up, and the coinage became virtually worthless. Not surprisingly, amid these difficulties, there developed what we may call a cultural crisis, characterized by changes of style in art, literature, and religion. Historians often describe this period as one of military anarchy, since few of the emperors reigned long enough to establish dynasties or even form policies. Most of these ephemeral rulers were rough soldiers without much in the way of education or preparation for ruling the empire. What would happen is one emperor would be assassinated, and the soldiers of the army nearest the emperor would acclaim their leading general to be the new emperor, and then somebody else would come along and assassinate him. And this was the process for about 50 years and led to all kinds of instability. So Diocletian then comes upon the scene in 284, and what he will then do is establish what is called the Tetrarchy. He saw that the empire was too big for one man to govern, and so he divided the empire in half, west and east, and he established, in a sense, two Augustas, as he called them, and two Caesars. The Augusta being the senior emperor and the Caesar being the junior emperor. And in the east, you would have Augusta and a Caesar. And in the west, you would have Augusta and a Caesar. And the idea was that the Augustas, in a sense, were the senior partners in this deal. And when they retired, the Caesars would step into their place. So it would create a transfer of power much more stable. And the division of power would be divided between the empire, and each side would have, in a sense, two emperors co-ruling that half of the empire. Didn't work out perfectly well, but it was somewhat successful. One of these one of the junior Caesars in the west was a man named Constantius Chlorus, and this is the father of St. Constantine. Timothy Gregory says, furthermore, the Tetrarchy was designed to solve one of the foremost political problems of the Roman state, the issue of succession. Thus, the Caesars were promised that they would, in time, succeed their respective Augusti and then choose new Caesars to perpetuate the dynasties. Diocletian emphasized his connection with the divine power and his place as senior emperor by taking the name Jovis, which means Jupiter-like, Jupiter being the Roman name for Zeus. For himself, this is how he would call himself, and Galerius, his fellow Augusti in the west. While the name Hercules, Herculeus, which means Hercule-like, was assigned to the junior emperors, the Caesars, which was Maximian and Constantius. He goes on, as we have seen, the members of the Tetrarchy were closely connected with the gods Jupiter and Hercules. And in this new system, the power of the emperor was seen as descending directly from the gods, rather than ascending from the will of the people, as had generally been the case upon the early and his colleagues, such as Aurelian, who had stressed the divine aspect of their rule. Of course, in many ways, this was nothing of the Principate, but the emphasis placed on the divine origin of imperial power was something new at this time. So that the idea that the emperors were somewhat divine or connected to the divine, this actually links all the way back into Mesopotamia and Persia. The idea that the emperors are sons of the gods originate in Persia. It's also present in Egypt, but it's brought in to Rome in the time of the emperors, and it becomes more and more important by the time of Diocletian. Instead of just being, in a sense, having the favor of the gods, now they're somehow directly linked to the gods themselves. And Gregory goes on, he says, the basic organizational structure of the state remained the individual city, in Greek, the polis, in Latin, the civitas, with its surrounding territory. Each city was administered locally by a city council. In Greek, this was the bullae, and in Latin, the curia. Remember that word curia, because it'll come back. Made up of wealthy individuals. So the local city was governed by a council of the city's wealthy people. Kind of similar in many ways to today. Even though we call it democracy, it's often the well-connected and the wealthy who end up in the places of power. In the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, however, the provinces were subdivided and made smaller, increasing the number from about 50 to 100. And each province was included in a new administrative district called a diocese. Remember that word, diocese. There were 12 of these dioceses, each of them administered by a vicar or a vicarius. The dioceses, in turn, were grouped into 4 praetorian prefects, each of them controlled by a praetorian prefect, who was the chief administrative officer and right-hand man of one of the emperors. So this is the structure, that kind of this spreading out the power. So in 305, after Diocletian had established all of this, he abdicates, along with his co-Augusta Maximian. Constantius Chlorus becomes Augustus of the West, goes on expedition with his son Constantine to Britain to push back the Picts, who were in what we call Scotland, trying to push down into what we think of as England. In York, Constantius Chlorus dies, and Constantine is proclaimed emperor by the troops in York. And I think the rock or the place that he stood is still preserved this day in the city of York in England. But this act of proclaiming Constantine as emperor by the troops, this is not necessarily accepted by the rest of the Tetrarchy. Constantine is declared not Augusti, but Caesar, the junior position of the West, and another man is declared to be the Augustus. So that's the state of things in 305, roughly. By 311, there is turmoil in the West. Maxentius, the son of the former Augustus, Maximian, who had gone into retirement, right? Maxentius wanted his son, Maxentius, to become, in a sense, at least Caesar or to replace him. But Diocletian didn't want that kind of father-son succession. And so he kind of nixed that idea. And so Maximian kind of had to, being kind of the lesser power of the two, had to agree. And his son didn't get what he hoped for. But then Maxentius basically goes and takes control of Rome and tries to, in a sense, acquire an imperial position through that, kind of challenging Constantine and the Augustus. The Augustus in the West doesn't prove to be very formidable, and he kind of leaves the scene. But Constantine, though, he crosses the Alps to face Maxentius. And it is then in 312 at what we call the Battle of Milvian Bridge. This is outside of the walls of Rome, on opposite side of the river, across what is the Milvian Bridge. This is up on the hill is where Constantine takes his position, and Maxentius makes the decision to leave the protection of the walls of the city, where he is in a sense in a stronger position, and go out to face Constantine. And not just that, but to cross, in a sense, the bridge. And he had set up also a pontoon bridge for his troops so that there would be more than just one way across the river. But this is a rather risky decision. And in the midst of the battle, he's routed, and his army has to flee across the bridges and across the river to safety. And in the process, the pontoon bridge comes loose and Maxentius drowns, being on horseback and in armor. He drowns in the river. This is very significant in the eyes of the Christians of that day. Before the battle, there are several accounts of that St. Constantine has a vision, some either in a dream or an awaking vision, or maybe both. And God speaks to him, and he sees the vision of a cross, or the Chi-Rho symbol, and he's told to conquer by this sign. And he wakes up, and he has that symbol put on the shields of his soldiers, and they go into the battle in a sense under the symbol of Christ. And so these two things, the vision of Constantine putting the sign of Christ on the shields and on what they call the labellum, I think is how you pronounce it. It's kind of the standard of the army. In a sense, on the top of that is put the Chi-Rho, meaning the first two letters in Christ's name. That's what they, in a sense, that's what leads the army into battle. Okay? So in a sense, under the banner of, in a sense, under the protection of Christ, Constantine is entering into battle. And then this happens. He routs Maxentius, and Maxentius drowns in the river. And so Eusebius, who writes the ecclesiastical history, this is how he frames the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He sees it as a new crossing of the Red Sea, and Constantine as a new Moses, and Maxentius being the tyrant akin to Pharaoh. Maxentius was not very popular in Rome. He was a rather tyrannical figure, and the Romans, through the gates of Rome, opened to Constantine and received him happily after this victory. Eusebius states in the ecclesiastical history that Constantine then had a statue of himself holding the cross placed in a busy section of the city with an inscription that read, quote, "By this saving sign, the true proof of courage, I saved your city from the yoke of the tyrant and set her," meaning the city, "free." So Timothy Gregory says of all of this, in the aftermath of the defeat of Maxentius, Constantine met Lysinius in 313 at Milan, the city of Milan, where Lysinius was at this point the co-emperor of the East. And so he comes to Milan, and Constantine and him basically make a deal on power. This marriage, family bond between these two now emperors. At this time, the two emperors published a series of documents, which included an edict that Galerius had issued earlier, Galerius being an earlier emperor. Tolerance to all, promised freedom of action to the Christian church, and promised protection church under Roman law. And it's this Edict of Milan, it's an edict of toleration, that all religions will be tolerated, including Christianity, which ends the Diocletian persecution. Because even though Diocletian has left the scene, the men he left behind him except Constantine in the West. So in 313, the edict is set, established. The empire is divided between Constantine and Lysinius between 314 and 324. They co-rule the empire. The east, west, and Lysinius goes back to the east. Lysinius, though, resumes the persecution of Christians after 316. And eventually, Constantine defeats Lysinius in 324, unifying the empire under his own rule. And so, this brings us to the point of how do we understand Constantine's conversion and the role that the state now, the empire, has in the church and the empire. Constantine's conversion at the Battle of Milvian Bridge is questioned by many in our modern day. Constantine continued to issue imperial coins with Sol Invictus on them. This was the Sol Invictus was the pagan deity that he had kind of claimed before his conversion. Another reason why people question this is because Constantine orders the execution of Lysinius, his former co-emperor. He also orders the execution of his son Crispus and his wife Fausta, Lysinius' sister. But also, we have to take into consideration these things. Constantine ended execution by crucifixion, ended the gladiatorial games, which was basically watching people kill each other for sport. He forbade divorce by mutual consent. He forbade immoderate torture of slaves. He forbade the deliberate murder of slaves by their masters. He forbade and discouraged the separate sale of slaves from the same family. So a family of slaves, he discouraged that you would sell them separately. He forbade the sale and use of Christian slave women for prostitution. He forbade the offering of pagan sacrifices by provincial governors. Now, this had multiple effects because in the ancient world, government and religion there's no separation here. Everything is tied together. The empire and the faith of the empire are all kind of intertwined with one another. And so imperial governors engaging in pagan sacrifice, in a sense, was just commonplace. There was no thought about this. But by forbidding the offering of pagan sacrifices, this one allows Christians to enter those positions because they couldn't. If your job description says, and you offer pagan sacrifice, you can't take that job. So by eliminating that, a Christian now can hold that position in government. But it also is a way of decreasing the importance of those sacrifices in the first place, in a sense, because the government's not, in a sense, participating in them anymore. He made the Lord's Day the official weekly day of rest. So if you want to understand why is the weekend Saturday and Sunday, well, at least the Sunday part, you can thank St. Constantine because he made it the day off. He gave the Lateran Palace to the Church of Rome after his victory in 312, which remained to be the residence of the Pope for 1,000 years, I think, at least. The church becomes an official agency for freeing slaves, or what we call manumission. It used to only be the courts, and only when the courts were in session. But once the church is allowed to be a place where you could come and free your slaves publicly, this can happen. It could happen with just this could be performed just in the presence of the clergy, of a clergyman, and on any day of the week. So this freeing of slaves is now detached even from the need of the court. He also decided to build a new city for the Roman capital, which he called New Rome. in which others called Constantinople. And in that city, there were no pagan temples. So we have to consider all of those things. So I'm going to read to you from Father John Strickland's volume 1 of his 4-volume series, Rise or Paradise and Utopia, the Rise and Fall of What the West Once Was, about St. Constantine. And I'll be reading several sections. But he does a beautiful job of dealing with these rather difficult subjects. He says, the city of Constantinople was officially named New Rome, but inevitably it came to bear the name of its founder as well. It was built on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, and historians have come to call the Christianized Roman Empire it ruled by that name. And I have to pause there. So whenever you hear of the Byzantine Empire, you have to tell yourself it never existed by that name. No one ever thought of themselves as being a Byzantine. This is a post-Enlightenment concept placed back into history. If you lived in Constantinople in the year 1200, you thought of yourself as a Roman, a part of the Roman Empire.
It's my understanding if you live in Constantinople now and you're among the Christians, you consider yourself Roman too.
Yeah.
That's what Father or Deacon Herman said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The word Byzantine in the Byzantine Empire is an academic term to distinguish the Roman Empire from its pagan period to its Christian period. But there was no time when there was like this thought of there was this break and the Roman Empire stopped and now begins and so forth. So you just have to hold that in your mind. So when you come across in the Byzantine Empire, you have to say, well, that's just the Roman Empire as it was after it was Christianized, largely in the East, not exclusively. There were periods when the empire spanned even back into Rome, the city of Rome. But that's the modern concept, right? That's how modern scholars frame history. And my point here is that it's not the proper frame exactly from our perspective. It's still the Roman Empire. If you go to the Middle East, the Christians are still called by some the Rum. Rum meaning the Romans. Because it was being Christian and being Roman at the time of the rise of Islam was synonymous. So it was not only religious reasons. It was not only religious reasons that made Constantine select the site. Byzantium had a highly defensible location and access to commerce between Europe and Asia. But it was above all a capital that would lack pagan temples. Instead, its public spaces would be marked by Christian temples, and Constantine constructed 2 in particular that became important in architectural monuments to Christendom. For the moment, the more preeminent was the Church of the Holy Apostles, where he gathered the relics of Christendom's founders. The other was Hagia Sophia, originally a relatively small church. It would one day, 2 centuries later, be rebuilt as the greatest temple in the world, the greatest Christian temple in the world. To these, Constantine added temples in other cities of his empire. Remember, a church in the traditional sense is called a temple. The church temple. So this is how our author is using that word temple, to mean a church building. After Constantine's mother Helen made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to discover the true cross on which Jesus was crucified, he ordered the construction of a church on the site of the empty tomb. This came to be known in the East as the Church of the Resurrection, or the Anastasis, and in the West as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Finally, back in Rome, Constantine ordered the construction of a church to house the relics of St. Peter. This church became known as St. Peter's Basilica. It is then also that he maybe one of his greatest accomplishment is St. Constantine is the one who initiates the first ecumenical council in Nicaea in 325. We'll deal with that council largely in next week's lecture. But for now, we'll just say that the Constantine convokes the council. He funds the travel and the housing of the 318 bishops who came to that council in Nicaea from as far away as Great Britain and the Middle East, that whole stretch of that part of the known world. Bishops came from all over to that council, and it was the empire that footed the bill. He himself did not participate in it. He never offered his opinion. It was the bishops solely who came together in council, who made the decisions, but it was at his request that they consider various issues. So, I'm going to go back to Father John Strickland. This is kind of a summary of Constantine's last days. Thus, Constantine began the long and ever incomplete process of integrating Christianity in government. He fell short of this goal on numerous occasions, sometimes notoriously. The case of his second wife, Fausta, and his son Crispus is an example. We will never know with certainty what was behind the decision, but in 326, Constantine ordered the execution of both. A possible explanation given by various sources for the otherwise capricious and senseless act is based on indications that Fausta may have resented Crispus, the issue of Constantine's first wife. And to orchestrate his downfall, she slandered him with the charge of seeking to seduce her. Constantine, a strict moralist, when it came to sexuality, became outraged and ordered his son's execution. Soon after this, however, he orders Fausta's death. This execution may have resulted when the emperor discovered, too late, that the accusation against his son was totally fabricated by Fausta, and that she herself may have seduced the youth, or tried to. Overcome with agonizing regret over his first action, he ordered her to be drowned in a hot bath. Such occasions of violence on the throne may be the reason Constantine deferred his baptism until the end of his life. He apparently held the belief that if he, as ruler, committed sins after his baptism, they would not as easily be remitted or forgiven. In any case, he finished his life's journey as a member of the church. You have to remember, I'm going to pause there. What St. Constantine is doing is he is a pivotal figure, literally a pivot. He is pivoting the empire from paganism to Christianity. And it's a process that it goes on. It's not like, a light switch happens, the banners get rolled up with the pagan symbols and down flops the cross on everything, right? That's fairy tale stuff. He's a pivotal figure. He's moving, right? His conversion is a process. He has the visions, and that's part of the process of his conversion through his, in a sense, he's a catechumen for the majority of his time as an emperor. And he's the first. He's the first to do this. He's the first to try to be Christian as an emperor. Everything he did, in a sense, with dealing with his son or his wife or his adversaries, right, was totally typical of Roman emperors. There was nothing unusual about him getting rid of his political opponents or even his family members, right? This was common among Roman emperors. So the charge that he's false in his faith, because he's doing what's typical of Roman emperors, is kind of a false claim. Because at the same time, you see him doing all these other things that are not typical at all of emperors. So we just have to keep that in mind. So in any case, back to Father John Strickland, in any case, he finished his life's journey as a member of the church. As he approached the end, his thoughts turned ever more towards the memory of his now departed Christian mother, Helen. Helen had been the first to share Christianity with him, and the image of her lifelong meekness must have been a comforting salve for a man haunted by the acts of manipulation and violence. It was certainly an inspiration. While Constantine had been feeding his ambitions at the side of a father who had abandoned her, Helen, for political gain. Remember, Constantine's father divorced her or left her for the sake of another woman who was more, in a sense, that marriage was more politically advantageous. Helen had been living out her life in modest obscurity. While he had been destroying his rivals for supreme power in the world's greatest empire, she had been planting charities for the well-being of the poor. While he had been erecting an urban monument named for himself, she had been visiting the city of Christ's death and resurrection. We know that the fragments of the true cross Helen sent to her son in Constantinople were received with great devotion. Perhaps it was then that Constantine began to plan his baptism. In any case, following Helen's example, he expressed the desire to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to use the occasion to be baptized in the Jordan River. Alas, he never fulfilled the intention, but his final days were spent on a journey that brought him to his mother's native town at the eastern end of the Sea of Marmara. To honor her memory, he had renamed the town Helenopolis. No pagan emperor had ever so publicly dignified a woman. He had followed this with the dedication of a church there in memory of Saint Lucian, one of the great persecution's last martyrs, who had died at Nicomedia when Helen was living there. He was one of her most beloved saints. It was during a visit to Helenopolis in 337 that Constantine fell ill. He called for the local bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia, and received the triple immersion of Christian baptism at his hands. The contrast this deathbed act made to those of his imperial predecessors could not have been more dramatic. As they lay dying, Roman emperors from Augustus to Tiberius, to Vespasian, to Diocletian, had fancied themselves gods, and the pagan priesthood had been devoted to acknowledging them as such. Now, the Roman emperor submitted himself to a Christian priest who claimed to serve only the one true God. The founder of Christian statecraft died on the day of Pentecost, still wearing his white baptismal robe. So the criticism of Constantine is a modern criticism. It's not ancient. I will read to you from Norman F. Cantor, his book, The Civilization of the Middle Ages, published 1994. This is a very widely distributed and read history text. I think it was a New York Times bestseller, book of the month club kind of stuff. And Cantor writes, thus the Christian church in the 4th century finally settled the great controversy that had so seriously disturbed ecclesiastical life. That is Arianism, which came about from Constantine's First Ecumenical Council. He goes on, but it did so only by subordinating itself to the will of the emperor. And so the criticism, which is a modern one, is that what Constantine does is not genuine. It's only for political gain. He's playing off the new rising of religion against the old one because he sees the Christians becoming the new dominant force in the empire and so forth. It's all just, in people's minds, political calculation. for the sake of his own power. And that the church, by working with Constantine, in a sense, defiles itself, taints itself, and submits itself to the whims of the emperor. This can be referred to as Cesaro Papism, which is a rather anachronistic term, because papism doesn't exist historically at this point in time, in terms of the papism being the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The idea that the Bishop of Rome is over the entire church. He has the sole authority over the entire church. Cesaro Papism, meaning Caesar has authority over the entire church, right? It's a historically anachronistic term itself, because in the 4th century, the bishops of Rome weren't claiming any authority over the whole church. And also they call this Constantinianism amongst many Protestant scholars. The perversion of Christianity from its original meaning and purpose by Constantine, kind of tainting the church, making the church obscure its mission, because now it gets political favor. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Father John Strickland. He says the church was therefore given a ministry of sanctifying the world. That is from Christ. All areas of human life became subject to this ministry. They included the relationships established through marriage, for instance, but they also included other relationships, such as those that were social or economic. The sanctification of the world extended to the time of the calendar and the space and places of worship. Art was sanctified, too, as was language when used in worship. The Greek letters chi and rho, when joined intentionally to honor the name of the Savior, became holy. Even the material creation received a special honor in the sacraments. Water, as Tertullian had indicated so eloquently, became the means of working the world's redemption. Wheat became Christ's very body, and grapes his blood. So he's saying the purpose of the church that God was given by Christ was to bring holiness, sanctity, God's presence into all creation, to save all creation. Father John goes on, he says, could not that realm of human culture and civilization known as government then also participate in the sanctification of the world? Question mark. With Constantine's conversion, even this part of the creation now came within the scope of the church's cosmic ministry. Father George Florovsky, one of the great Orthodox thinkers of the 20th century, this is what he says. He says, in fact, Constantine was offering to the church not only peace and freedom, but also protection and close cooperation. Indeed, he was urging the church and her leaders to join with him in the renovation of the empire. This new turn of imperial policy and tactics was received by Christians with appreciation, but not without some embarrassment and surprise. Remember, the Edict of Milan is 313. The First Ecumenical Council is 325. You literally had bishops who had lost parts of their body or their part or an eye or two, or been physically mutilated in the persecution, who attended the First Ecumenical Council. The empire that mutilated them paid for them to go to the council. This is the radical nature of the change that Constantine brings into civilization. Okay? It's in that context that the church is, that's why I titled this, in a sense, the empire's embrace of Christ. The church has to respond to that embrace. How do you do that? When it hadn't embraced you before, it beat you and killed you. So this is why Father George Florovsky says this was astounding. It was met with appreciation and embarrassment and surprise and like, what do we do? And so this idea of can the government be sanctified was an open question. In the time of Tertullian, this is he's in the 3rd century, in the 200s, a Latin-speaking father and thinker, Father George Florovsky of him says, already Tertullian was asking certain awkward questions, although in his own time they were no more than rhetorical questions. Could Caesars accept Christ and believe in him? Could then a Christian be a Caesar, that is, belong at once to two conflicting orders, the church and the world? It seems that one of the reasons for which he was declaring his own baptism till his very last days was precisely his dim feeling that it was inconvenient to be Christian and Caesar at the same time. This is Father George's ideas of why Constantine put his baptism off. He was trying to wrap his mind around how does one be Caesar and a Christian? Do what Caesars do in a Christian way. And he put his baptism off, possibly trying to figure that out in the process. Father George Florovsky, he goes on, he says, the leaders of the church were compelled time and again to challenge the persistent attempts of Caesars to exercise their supreme authority also in religious matters. Remember, that's what was normal in the empire. The emperors were religious figures. They were people who would sacrifice. They functioned in religious matter. The rise of monasticism, which we'll talk about in another lecture, in the 4th century was no accident, Father George Florovsky says. It was rather an attempt to escape the imperial problem and to build an autonomous Christian society outside the borders of the empire or outside the camp. On the other hand, the church could not evade her responsibility for the world or surrender her missionary task. Indeed, the church was concerned not only with individuals, but also with society, even with the whole of mankind. Even kingdoms of this world had to be brought ultimately into the obedience of Christ. Nor was the empire prepared to leave the church alone or to dispense with her help and service. The church was already a strong institution, strong by her faith and discipline, and spread everywhere, even in the remote corners of the inhabited earth. Thus, the church was forced finally into alliance with the empire by the double pressure of her own missionary vocation and of the traditional logic of empire. That's what Father George says. So modern critics want to criticize the church and Constantine because of our own modern conceptions of the separation of church and state, which were completely foreign and not present in the ancient world whatsoever to anyone. All civilizations had the intermingling of government and religion in civilizations. And so when the empire decides to embrace Christ, the church has to respond, in a sense, and baptize the empire. And that's what his task was then to do, to try and baptize the empire. And Father George Florovsky says, there was but one incomprehensive Christian society, or we could say nation, which was at once a church and a state. In this one society, there were different orders of powers, clearly distinguished but closely correlated, spiritual and temporal, ecclesiastical and political. But the society itself was intrinsically one. This idea was by no means a new one. Ancient Israel was at once a kingdom and a church. The Roman Empire had always been a politico-ecclesiastical institution, and it also retained this double character after it had been christened or baptized. In the Christian Commonwealth, churchmanship and citizenship were not only coextensive, but simply identical. And then we're going to go back to almost done. Last point. Father John Strickland to sum us up. What was difficult for the church was the place of violence and coercion in government. So this was the main sticking point of how does the church deal with this? When you're trying to, in a sense, work with the government or baptize a government. This could not be sanctified, meaning the violence, could not be sanctified because it was not part of God's original creation, but a sinful corruption of that creation. This had been more than evident in the Roman government's treatment of Jesus at his judgment and crucifixion. It was evident also in the pagan government's policies of persecution, which had only recently come to an end with the Edict of Milan. Now that the government was in the hands of Christian thought, many wondered whether Constantine would be able to live like a Christian and apply to his action the gospel commandments of mercy and forgiveness. Constantine's conversion to Christianity earned him many enemies, not all of them pagans. Many have been Christians, and curiously, more of them live in our time than in his. There is very little suggestion that 4th century Christians, many of whom had barely survived the recent persecution, resisted the idea of a Christian sovereign or had scruples concerning his legitimacy. Indeed, just the opposite is true. What we actually see is a chorus of contemporary approval and support of Constantine. But in much latter times, the first Christian emperor has become the object of widespread criticism and even condemnation. He is sometimes presented as a foolishly credulous ruler who saddled the Roman state with an apathetic religion at a time when domineering values were needed. Others have seen him as a cynical statesman who appropriated Christianity in order to co-opt the church. And there are many more who have simply been scandalized by his acts of political violence, such as his decision to execute his wife and son. Among modern Christians, however, an even more damning and influential indictment is made. This is often expressed by the term Constantinianism. The word has been given wide circulation, especially by modern Protestants who regard the rise of a Christian state to be a betrayal of the church's true vocation. Early expressions of this idea are to be found during the Reformation, when Roman Catholicism's official hold on European statecraft represented an obstacle to the reform. More than this, all that was considered wrong with Western Christianity at that time, the papacy, clericalism, monasticism, sacramental worship, was tracked back to the 4th century when the church, quote, fell into worldliness and superstition. Constantinianism became a catchphrase for much that was wrong with post-apostolic Christianity, supporting the historical ignorant view that between the age of the apostles and the time of Martin Luther stretched an unmitigated period of graceless idolatry. So that whole idea of the Protestant Reformation, that in a sense you have the apostles and then nothing, and then Martin Luther, which spans over 1,000 years of history, it's all laid at the feet of Constantine. He's the problem. He screwed everything up. He tainted Christianity. Modern theologians have given Constantinianism a more sophisticated meaning. Some have used it to describe a form of Christianity that, in their view, has become a bulwark for politics and an obstacle to the gospel. Christian pacifists like Stanley Hauerwas have been particularly drawn to this line of criticism, claiming that the rise of a Christian state led inevitably to the collapse of the original meaning of Christian identity, which he himself knows what that supposedly should be in this day and age, as opposed to the people which existed 1,000, 1,500 years before him. As Christians flooded the church in order to become integrated in Rome or Byzantium or England or America, their commitment to the gospel dissolved. The result of this approach is a kind of retroactive, a tendency to purge the past of those elements of historical Christianity that modern, largely Calvinist, models of faith cannot accommodate, tolerate. What is more, such criticisms are often based on a skewed account of the history. With Constantine, the church surely entered a period in her history marked by reoccurring temptations towards political civility. Below, I discuss a particularly noxious form of this known as Cesaro Papism. But that is not the only or most important outcome of his conversion. One theologian who has recently come to the defense of Constantine's legacy is Peter Leithart, himself from a Reformed and therefore Calvinist background. In addition to reviewing a range of historical details and nuances often ignored by his fellow Protestant critics, Leithart gives special attention to the sacramental character of traditional Christianity. He notes that pagan Rome was a civilization of blood sacrifice. Every city had elaborate public rituals in which animals were slaughtered as offerings to the gods for the well-being of the state. The public games were effectively human sacrifices. What he did, remarkably, is to replace blood sacrifice with the church's liturgical bloodless sacrifice. For the first time in history, human civilization depended on the sacramental presence of the incarnate God. The Eucharist brought an end to sacrifice. Nothing more could be done by human beings once the Son had offered himself on the cross. All they could do was to follow him there, taking up the cross by loving one another. Quote, I require mercy and not sacrifice, Jesus had repeated from the prophet Hosea in Matthew 12:7. In fact, love was the one way the Christian could enter into the event of Christ's passion, offering himself as a living sacrifice. Romans 12:1. Completely refuting the claims of Constantine's detractors, then, Leithart notes that by abolishing public sacrifices and establishing Eucharistic worship throughout the empire, Constantine effectively opened the way for replacing his subjects' allegiance to the earthly state with an allegiance to the kingdom of heaven. Rome was now, at least in principle, a Eucharistic civitas, or a Eucharistic city, whose model was not an earthly order, but on an eschatological one, or in other words, paradise. It might be noted that Leithart does not stop here, but goes on to offer a chilling reflection on what happens when the Christian state so constituted does indeed fall from its sacramental foundation. It degenerates into what he calls nihilistic politics. In modern times, he observes secularism prevents the state from honoring a higher power, whose existence it rejects, either formally or in practice. Neither Christianity's bloodless sacrifice or the Eucharist, nor paganism's blood sacrifices or animals and humans have any formal legitimacy. But the state still requires a kind of sacrifice through acts of public devotion and submission to it. And in the post-Christian Christendom of the 20th century, such acts again assume an almost ritual form when millions were put to death in the sacred name of the proletariat, the master race, or even the autonomous individual. So in summary, Constantine is the first to face the question of how to be a Christian emperor. No one else had faced that. And his legacy, the fruit of what he does, is a Roman Empire that is Christianized, it's baptized, that lasts. Anybody know when it ends? Somebody said 1400s. Kevin?
Isn't it in the time of the Middle Ages?
Yeah. Constantinople remains a Christian city until 1453. In a sense, the vestiges of his Christian Roman Empire lasts until the sack of Constantinople, or the taking of Constantinople by Mehmed II in May, I think 21st or 22nd, maybe. It's in May of 1453. And up until that time, in a sense, you had a symphony between the church and the saint, where the emperor no longer sees himself as a god, but subservient to God. That Constantine is the one who is the servant of God, that God is the higher authority. He's not equal to God, like Diocletian would say, but God is now the authority, and the emperors are under his authority. Their authority comes now from God, kind of like the Roman emperors of the past, but it's been changed. Because the emperors now are seen as just men. They're not divine in any way. They're like the rest of us. They're fallible. They can be called to account. And future emperors will be chastised by saints and called to public repentance. No Roman emperor would have accepted that in the pagan days. So the structure of society and the way it functions radically changes from Constantine on. And the whole reason we have this idea of the state, that there's a higher power than the state, originates with Constantine. He manifests that, he allows that reality to manifest itself in the empire for the first time. That he becomes, in a sense, not the sole power, but the servant of the highest power. And we can argue about whether he made mistakes in doing that. Well, but if we were humble, we would know that we ourselves make mistakes in all of that. How would we do in Constantine's place as the first Christian emperor? I don't know if we would do better than him. I doubt I would. I would, the lust of power, right, corrupts many people. But he had to struggle with that, the first to do that. And therefore, from his time on, Christians look to him as in a sense, the prototypical, the idyllic sovereign throughout all the Middle Ages. If you're a good king, you're a new Constantine. That was the way that Constantine was remembered until the Reformation. Good kings lived and acted and reigned like a new Constantine and a new Helen. Right? Kings and queens, right? Helen becomes the idyllic or the prototypical, the example of what a queen or an empress should be like, even though that was his mother, which there's a parallel to that in Israel. Because in Israel, the king reigned and his mother sat at his right hand, which then is taken up again by Christ, because Christ is the king of Israel, and he places his mother at his right hand. And then when you get to the Christianization of the Roman Empire, the sovereign, the emperor, reigns, and the woman next to him is his mother. The same pattern. So this carries through. And so they become, right? That's why they have a joint feast, this feast of Saints Constantine and Helen every year in May. Which I think that is the 21st. I think the fall of Constantinople is earlier in May, if I remember right. But they become, in a sense, the iconic sovereigns until the Reformation, and things change. So, but we'll deal with that when we get there. So, questions? Any questions from online either? the chat box is there, so you can type them if you have any questions. So. Next week, if you're thinking of questions, next week we're going to deal with the councils, the early councils of the church. With history, there's, you can't cover everything in one talk, so we kind of deal with things in a circular manner, covering certain aspects and then going back and covering other things. So we'll go back and cover early councils, regional councils that come before the Council of Nicaea, Nicaea itself, and I believe we'll take it through the Council of Ephesus, the third council, which is in 431. So we end our time tonight in 337. Next week we'll get up to 431 as we're creeping through the history of Christianity. So God bless you all. Bye-bye.